So many times we get hung up, we get focused on God. If you promised this to me, if you told this to me, then this and this and this and this and this should happen. But I'm seeing over here, Elisha's dead. So how can I trust that this promise is true? And what happens? A dead guy gets thrown on another dead guy, and the one comes back to life. You know, Elisha is probably one of the most influential men, one of the most influential people that you'll find in all of the entire Old Testament. He's the successor to Elijah. He operates during the reigns of over 6 kings during a time span of roughly 60 years. I am not going to be here 60 years. If I am, I'll be like 105 or something. So it's not going to happen. I love you all, but I don't love you all 105. So, but let's think about that. Jesus, during his ministry, during his own ministry, Jesus only ministered 3 years. Jesus was only alive for a little over 30 years. He is credited with over 28 miracles, which doubles what Elijah did, his predecessor. I'm trying to get across to you the idea that this man had a very extensive ministry. He met and counseled many kings. God used him to perform miracles during his lifetime. He was a man that was well respected and thought of in the world that he lived in. Even still, though, there were moments that I am certain that he himself looked around and thought what he was doing was pointless. Just look at this one story alone. I want you to see this story. Elisha is counseling this king in the final moments of his life. He's dying and he's counseling the king and he's talking to the king about what he should do. And this king, still, with all he has seen and watched in his life, doesn't quite get it right. He does what the prophet asked him to do, but almost in like a placating manner, like, okay, if I have to, I'll do this. I don't think that Elisha was looking at this moment thinking, man, this is one last time for me to tell somebody off. I think he went into this hoping for a victory. I think he went into this hoping for something substantial to happen, and yet Jehoash doesn't follow through well enough. And then we see what happens. Elisha dies. Now, I don't know if it's like, this is how my brain works, okay? Like the whole time I'm reading this story, like I just wonder if this is how it happens because of the way this story is written. We don't know if he dies like right then or if he dies a little while later on. We don't know. It just says he gets done talking to him and he dies. And I just wonder if he's sitting there and the king does what he does and he's mad at him and Elisha tells him off and he's just like, I'm done with you. I'm just going to die. Like, you know, have you ever been having one of those conversations with your kids and it's just like, I just need to go to sleep now. Like, it's just, this is not going anywhere. And so I don't know. It's just kind of what I'm thinking as I'm reading this story. He's just like, you know what? I'm just going to die. This is pointless. But anyway, he dies. They go to bury him. He's buried in a tomb, and it would be assumed then, in most cases, somebody dies, we bury them, end of story, right? We'll tell a few good stories later on, write down some of his deeds in 2 Kings, and we'll call it good. But something else happens. During this period of time, there would be these Moabite raiders that would come in, and they would ride in and they would raid. Easy pickings because Israel's kind of a weak country, so let's go in and let's raid. Let's do what we're going to do. They'd take their plunder and their slaves, whatever else they could carry, and they would take it and they would go home. And on one occasion, we see that there's some Israelites are in the middle of a funeral. They've got their friend. They're carrying him to this tomb where they're going to bury him. And afar off, way off in the distance, they see these raiders coming. They see these guys coming. They're afraid for their lives. They don't know what to do. They're scared. They're petrified. They're terrified. And so what do? They take their buddy, who they're like, I missed him so much. I love this guy who's my best friend. There's raiders. Yeet. And they throw him into the tomb and they're gone. They just leave him. It doesn't tell us if they knew that was Elisha's tomb. It doesn't tell us that. It doesn't tell us if they knew who Elisha was, even though we can probably assume they probably did. But something unseen and unexpected occurs. They throw their friend in there. It says, as soon as the body touched the bones of Elisha, he jumped to his feet. Now, once again, my head. I just wonder, like, when the guy died, had he been like mid-argument with his wife? And then, like, they throw him in, he comes to life, and he jumps to his feet because he's like, oh, and one more thing, let me tell you. And then he's like, where am I? What's going on? And then here's the other thing that I think about. They throw him in there, they throw him in this tomb, and they take off and they run, and the guy gets resurrected. He jumps to his feet only to see that there's these raiders coming, and his friends have hightailed it and left him, and he's there by himself. Like, this guy's, what an amazing miracle, but at the same time, that's a horrible situation to find yourself left in. And here's the thing. These guys would have been raised on stories of some of the great heroes of Scripture. They would have known about King David defeating Goliath because that had happened prior to this. They would have known about Gideon and his victory because that had happened prior to this. They would have known names like Samson and Noah and Moses. All of these names would have been known to them, and yet they were sitting there terrified. All of these stories that they had heard time and time and time and time again of God delivering people, of God handing victory in hopeless situations. All of these stories would have been well known to these guys. And in a moment of fear, they take their friend and throw him into a tomb that was not the one that was prepared for that guy, and they run and they hide. They feel like they have no other choice in the situation. They see that death's already claimed my friend. I shouldn't wait around for it to come and get me too, so I'm out of here. And you know, earlier in our text when we were reading this, we heard talk about King Jehoash, and that while his victory wouldn't be total, he would still have some victory over his enemies for a little bit of time. But then what happens? Like Elisha makes this prophecy that this is going to happen, but I want you to think about Jehoash and his situation. Like every other time Elisha had told him something or had talked to one of his predecessors, when God had brought that about, Elisha had still been there. But now Elisha says that this thing is going to happen, but he's dead. What's going to be my fate? When he died, did the promise die with him? So God does something in this miracle that I want you to see. When they take their friend and they throw him in there onto the bones of Elisha, not knowing what was going to happen, God performs a miracle. And it lets him know, lets the king know in that moment that something is way bigger than the pile of bones in that tomb. When they throw him in there, it lets them know that the promise of God supersedes the tomb. So many times we get hung up, we get focused on God. If you promised this to me, if you told this to me, then this and this and this and this and this should happen. But I'm seeing over here, Elisha's dead. So how can I trust that this promise is true? How can I trust that this promise is real? And what happens? A dead guy gets thrown on another dead guy, and the one comes back to life. Because the power of God is not subject to anything but God. The power that God promises, the things that God does, the things that God promises to us through His Word, they are not predicated on me. They are not predicated and built upon anything other than the promise and the nature of who God is. I don't come into this place to worship myself. I don't come into this place to worship our worship team, as amazing as they are. I don't come into this place to worship this building. I come into this place to worship God corporately with brothers and sisters, because that is what I am here for. I'm not here based simply on something, but I am here because I am following after the promises that God has given to me, the things that God has set out in front of me, the things that God has established in my life. When I start holding on to the promises of people and onto the promises of men, I'm just going to tell you stuff. I'm going to tell you something. One of these days, I'm going to tell you I'm going to do something, and I'm not going to do it. Not because I hate you, because I'm just going to forget. And if your relationship and your walk with God is built upon the promises that Jake gives you, you are not going to get very far. Because our faith has to be built upon nothing less than Jesus Christ. It has to be built on nothing less than the promise that we have in God. The king could trust the promise of God because it was the promise of God, not the promise of Elisha. When we lean on the promises of God and not on the promises of people, we can trust that God is going to fulfill the things that he has said that he will do. The power of God can still work, even when the instrument that he has used is still no longer drawing breath. And the promises of God that God makes are not dependent on people because they are given by God. The man who died had lost every bit of his future. Everything that he had been promised, everything that he had hoped for, everything that he had saved and planned and worked for was gone. It was gone. It did him absolutely no good. Any plans he might have had with his friends who threw him in the tomb were over. Any goals he had set for himself wouldn't be fulfilled. Every simple joy of life that he had taken for granted up to that point, he would never experience again. His life was over. And then suddenly, without explanation, it wasn't. 1 second he was gone, and the very next he was on his feet in a tomb in a place that he didn't recognize, because God had changed everything from the way that it was into what only God could see it being. Many, many people still seek life where they can only find death. And Jesus offers life where he can be found. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 6 says, "It is impossible to please God without faith. Anyone who wants to come to him must believe that God exists and that he rewards those who sincerely seek him." He is available to be found. He is available to have a relationship with. He is available to be encountered. But in order for those things to happen, we have to seek him. We have to look for him. And so for so long, so many people have been holding on to this idea of, I will relegate God, I'll put Jesus into this spot of my life, and I'll give him precedence there, but everywhere else is mine. That is looking for life in death. Either I give the source of life my life, not a piece of it, not a part of it, not a section of it, not what I'm okay with. Either I give him my life, or I hold on to it for myself. And at some point, we've got to decide, what am I doing? Am I throwing things away because I don't feel like God can come through? Am I giving up on things because I don't feel like God can come through? Am I feeling like once that stuff I put in that tomb is in there and that stone is rolled in place, then it's there? But I'm telling you what, the years that alcohol and drugs and everything else stole, Jesus can roll that stone away, y'all. All of those things that we feel like are dead and broken and hopeless and lost and gone, Jesus can roll that away. So stop telling Jesus, I'll give you Sunday, and start giving him all of it. Because if he's got access to all of it, there's a lot of stuff he can start unpacking. There's a lot of stuff he can start working with. There's a lot of changes he can begin to make. I don't want my walk with God, and I pray that this is the same for y'all. I don't want my walk with God to just be a part of my life. I want it to be my life. I want it to be my life. I want my walk with God to pour over into my home and into my family. In order for me to be the man of God that I am called to be, in order for me to be the dad to my kids that I need to be, in order for me to be the husband to my wife that I need to be, in order for me to step into everything that God has for me, I have got to stop looking for life amongst dead things. Jesus is alive. He wants a relationship with you. He wants to change your yesterday into the tomorrow that he sees. He wants to change those broken and battered things into the things that he can change them into. But in order to do that, you gotta stop looking for life in the tombs. You gotta stop. Because the only thing you're gonna find there is an empty tomb. Because he is not there, y'all. He is alive.